Welcome to the Growth Over Grades podcast, a show connecting you with thought leaders, pioneers, and change agents who are leading the charge to support schools and districts in making the shift toward competency-based education and to promote growth over grades. I'm Jordan Lewis, and on the show today, we talk to the Director of Policy at the Washington State Board of Education, Alissa Muller. Alissa has been instrumental in helping to shape educational policies that focus on student-centered learning and mastery-based education across Washington State. As a director of the Mastery-Based Learning Collaborative, Alissa and her team have been at the forefront of efforts to transform Washington's education system, moving it toward a model that emphasizes individual student growth and competency over traditional grading systems. With her background in public administration from the University of Washington, Alissa has been uniquely positioned to bridge the gap between policymaking and practical implementation in schools across the state. Her work has been crucial in developing strategies to increase the capacity for mastery-based learning in schools across the state and to help prepare students for the challenges of the 21st century. In today's episode, we dive deep into mastery-based learning, the system-level shifts taking place to foster innovation in schools, and how Washington State is promoting personalized learning pathways towards graduation to ensure that every student is successful. We discuss overcoming challenges to garner a culture of change and why listening to students is the best way to bring about positive change in our education system. Now to my conversation with Alissa Muller. Alissa, thank you so much for joining us here on the show. We're really excited to have you. We're really excited to dive into mastery-based learning. It's one of those topics that is near and dear to my heart as an educator, but also our audience and listeners are really driving into this world and looking for ways to kind of break the traditional mold. So, Alissa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. My pleasure to be here with you today.
Alissa, talk to us a little bit here about your background in education and the journey that you took to get to the State Board of Education.
Yeah, absolutely. I have been at the State Board of Education for 7 years. Before that, I had worked in some nonprofits in Texas that had supported innovation in education and finding ways for students to really experience joy in their learning, and fell in love with that, knew that, I wanted to be in education for a career. Growing up, my brother was dyslexic and had ADHD, and school was just not a place where he was comfortable or ever enjoyed being. And I hated that because I loved school growing up, right? But a lot of kids don't. And so I've always wanted to try to find ways, to do my little part to make the education system a place that really supports every kind of student. So, my husband and I are from Texas originally, but my husband was former military. And so when we moved out here with the Navy, I got my master's in public policy from the University of Washington and found the opportunity with State Board and, feels like home in a way. It's my dream job. I love getting to do this work every day.
It really resonates how you sought out to help create an education system that supports each student. And we're foreshadowing a little bit into kind of what the mastery-based learning work is doing, but it just really resonates and hits home with me. And I even just think about my own upbringing and how I approach school versus family members of mine who were very, naturally gifted, whereas I had to work really hard and implement different study strategies to get that same level of enrichment out of the system. And it's just great to see that that's the philosophy and kind of perspective that you're bringing forward. And with that foreshadowing in mind, I've said mastery-based learning a few times. Let's level set and just for the listeners, help us understand a little bit about what mastery-based learning is in the context of the State Board of Education.
Sure. So mastery-based learning has sort of some common definitions nationally and internationally, where there's some core components. So students are able to advance at different paces as they master knowledge and skills tied to the state standards. They demonstrate their mastery of those skills and standards through really meaningful, authentic assessments. And really importantly, students are able to take ownership of their own learning and receive support based on their individualized needs and interests. So while mastery-based learning programs are going to look different, across every school based on their local context, those are some of the really core components that every mastery-based learning school would really focus on.
I know we'll again get to some of those components. We see and hear a lot about this idea of students taking more ownership in their learning and having this opportunity to engage. How do you see that differing so heavily from some of the more traditional models that we see being implemented today?
I think it can be a shift, right? Like sometimes we hear folks say, well, mastery-based learning is just good teaching, which it is, right? It is good teaching. And a lot of the components of mastery-based learning are really based on research around how students learn best. But I think it does take a shift, at least at a system level, right? Like there might be teachers, in classrooms around the state that are doing bits and pieces of some of those components. But I think when we really start to see the shift is when an entire school building comes together and norms around those components, right? So that a student is getting the same expectation and the same learning experience in Mrs. Smith's class versus Mr. Brown's class, right? Like no matter who your teacher is, you have the same expectation of being able to really collaborate with your teacher and focus on kind of co-creating your learning journey based on your interests, based on your skills and what you want to focus on. That might look a little different from, your friend's learning journey based on what, interests they have, what knowledge they have coming in. And so I do think at a system, it is sort of a change to really have some of the maybe power or, authority over who's designing the learning experience to be really shared between adults and students.
And I imagine, Alissa, as some students are sort of going down this journey of co-creation and it is very personalized to that student and their interests, the assessments or measurements are also going to have to be really personalized.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think sometimes, teachers can get understandably concerned around, well, hold on, do I have to create 30 different tests? Like, no, absolutely not. You're still going to be, testing the same skills, but how students are going to demonstrate that knowledge might look different, right? So some students might want to give a presentation. Some students might want to write a report. Some students are going to want to do a project, right? So, you're still having the same rubric, you're still testing the same standards and skills. It's just how students are wanting to show that they have learned those skills is going to look really different. You're exactly right.
I just think it's a really important call out to almost double click on. So many teachers and system leaders that we speak to have that fear that moving down this road is going to cause teachers to be overworked. And I think that highlighted example you just mentioned really can begin to reduce the stigma around that, because the method of which they're going to assess doesn't necessarily need to change for each individual student. I just love that call out of it's the demonstration that is going to be personalized, and you can still have that opportunity to assess in that capacity. So I know we're going to talk a bit further about sort of what those measurements look like in a bit. But I know that within this mastery-based learning work that's being done by the State Board of Education, there's this really big emphasis on culturally responsive and sustaining mastery-based learning. Can you just expand on that and kind of what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So more academic definition to start, right? And then we can talk about examples, but culturally responsive sustaining education is really grounded in a cultural view of learning and human development in which multiple expressions of diversity, so for instance, race and gender and language and sexual orientation, are all recognized and regarded as assets for teaching and learning, right? So we all come from a different background, from a different perspective, and that's a good thing, right? And so the aim of culturally responsive sustaining education is really to elevate historically marginalized voices and to prepare students for really rigorous learning and connecting across differences and becoming agents of positive social change.
And when we start thinking about connectivity to the mastery-based models, how do you see schools approaching that? Is it a lot of that ability to have differentiated instruction based on the student interests? Is it a different approach to teaching strategies? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is sometimes if we just change, for instance, a lesson plan, right? But we don't change the culture of the school, then nothing changes, right? So we know that there are students that school was not well designed for, right? There are groups of students that school was not well designed for. Students with disabilities, students of color. There are groups that our system has historically not served well. So I think part of it is just keeping that in mind, right? And wanting to intentionally think about how do we make every single student feel welcome and loved in the classroom, right? And so working on at a school level, thinking about school culture, making school a place where everyone belongs and everyone really is ready to build relationships and learn together. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good distinction because it's a really hot topic in our systems these days. Every strategic plan is having an emphasis put on that. But I feel like there's a lot of sensitivity around actually approaching and implementing on that topic because it is so heated. And there's a lot of tension surrounding that. So I appreciate that we can take a step forward by just having that intentionality in our classroom and thinking about the students on that unique perspective. It also makes me think, Alissa, just a lot about some character education initiatives that are happening right now and how we're trying to allow for empathetic students to come out of our classrooms and to have that more awareness factor. And I see a lot of connections between that approach to mastery-based learning and other, factors or other initiatives that are becoming quite popular in our system. So Alissa, talk to us just a little bit about why Washington State chose to go down the road with a focus on mastery-based learning.
Sure. Yeah. In Washington State, it's interesting. Of course, every state is different as far as, what policies they have on the books or, sort of what's allowable to start with, because there's a lot of states that are really interested in mastery or competency-based education. In Washington, we've had some policies on the books for years, 10 years, 20 years around delinking the definition of a high school credit from seat time. Now funding is still based on seat time. So that, that's a different rabbit hole we can go down. But, there have been other policies that have allowed schools to have a waiver of the credit-based graduation requirements, to award credit to students based on mastery of the state standards and not seat time, right? So we've had all these policies on the books for years, and yet we didn't see schools really transitioning to mastery-based learning. And I think some of that is, of course, schools are busy and teachers and administrators are superheroes trying to do, 87,000 things at the same time, right? And so without some more intentional guidance from a state level, understandably, it's not something that a lot of schools had focused on. But there have been, the State Board of Education has had a focus on mastery-based learning for years. There have been legislative champions in our state that have been really focused on mastery-based learning for a number of years. And so a few years back, we actually had a state work group around mastery-based learning with some of those champions involved. We have representatives from around the education system, including probably our most valuable member, a current high school student, right, to talk about the current student experience. But I think the work group really sort of coalesced around the fact that, even before the coronavirus pandemic, we've known that schools haven't been serving all groups of students equitably, right? Just like we were talking about earlier. But then during the pandemic, which was sort of in the middle of the work group around mastery-based learning at the state, then we're seeing schools experience sort of this unprecedented disruption, and it's forcing educators to think differently around how are they going to engage with students and how are we really going to kind of force some changes in our systems to think differently about that, right? And so I think we kind of came to a vision as a state through that work group that, mastery-based learning is not a silver bullet. And yet it is a way to transform our education system, because if you do it intentionally, then you can have teaching methods that are designed to really equitably engage every student in ways that best support their individual student learning journey. And so I think the focus for Washington has really been like mastery-based learning is a way that we are going to intentionally try to eliminate the achievement gap by providing access to equitable education opportunities and closing that opportunity gap, right? Like this is the way that we've chosen that we're going to try to attack those problems.
And building off of that, as you are really beginning to bring this policy forward, giving space for educators to try out these new strategies, your state board education is running a mastery-based learning collaborative. Now, for the listeners that are unfamiliar, I certainly recommend for you to just Google the Mastery-Based Learning Collaborative because they're doing some really amazing work. But Alissa, talk to us a bit about what that collaborative is and how it's starting to shift the tides across the state.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the state work group's recommendations was really to sort of create a community of schools doing this work together, right? Because the work group heard from several schools in our state that have been a pioneer of this work, one of which you just talked to, Gibson, Eck, and Issaquah has been doing this work for a while. And so, the work group is hearing from some of these schools saying, this is the right work. And it's hard work. And so it's really hard to do this work without a community to problem solve together. And so the legislature provided some funding to the state board to then in turn create the Mastery-Based Learning Collaborative, which is a group of schools that is really focusing on mastery-based learning plus culturally responsive sustaining education practices and implementing those two things together. And so through the MBLC, the state has hired professional learning providers to really train educators and administrators in these practices and think about how can, based on their local context, schools implement, right? And so we have 2 cohorts now. We have 47 schools in 28 districts across the state. We started with 23 schools in cohort 1 back in 2022 and added another 24 schools this spring. And we've sort of designed those cohorts to be a 4-year grant cycle. Now, granted, full implementation of mastery-based learning, research would say, can take much more than 4 years, sure, depending on where you're starting from, how big your school is, and a bunch of other factors, right? But, the legislature committed to, at least for cohort 1, paying for 4 years to give schools the time to really dig in on that professional learning, be in a community of schools, have some dedicated coaching, and, through those kind of 4 years, at least build enough sustainable practices that then they could continue that implementation without the state support. So it's such a great community. I mean, we set it up to where schools would learn from each other, and it's so exciting to see that. I talked to one school and I'm like, oh, you might consider talking to, school B. And they're like, oh, we just talked to them last week. And I'm like, great, my work's done, right? Like you're already making those connections and collaborating and thinking about, what can you learn from each other based on each other's experiences.
And I just love when you hear about school leaders that are just taking it upon themselves to work amongst that community, because while the state and from your seat, you have a lot of experience and can help make those connections. I mean, you're not living it day to day. You're not in the building seeing the realities. And it takes another building administrator to help share those strategies, a teacher to teacher. That's why we see so many in-person events coming back bigger than ever, because that face-to-face does provide so much value. But Alissa, I mean, as you were chatting, 2 major curiosities sort of came to mind for me as we're thinking about that collaborative. The first one really here is, what are some of the common challenges that you're hearing from schools as they enter into the collaborative to start making that shift?
Oh man, that's a good question. I mean, it depends, of course, based on each particular school and kind of what level of buy-in they have when they join, right? Because in the collaborative, we have schools that have been doing this work for years, like Gibson Eck, like Avanti High School, like several others. We have schools that are just starting and they're like, what's mastery-based learning? And then we have schools in the middle, right? So, for schools that are newer, or for schools, and this is going to be an overgeneralization, but we have some schools that have said to me, We have a very senior teaching staff. They've been doing this work for a long time. They've been teachers for 20 to 30 years. They don't want to change things. That's not every teacher who's been teaching for that long, right? Overgeneralization. But so for some schools, I think the hardest thing is just getting that buy-in, right? And helping teachers understand the why, helping teachers understand that this is going to serve kids better. And, the engagement problems that you've been complaining about, like this can help. We have other schools that live in conservative communities, right? And so their biggest concern is their community pushback around culturally responsive and sustaining education, right? We have some schools dealing with budget crisis, just like schools all over, right? And so their biggest concern is, how am I going to have a more personalized learning model with super high teacher to student ratios? So it really depends on the school context. But it's nice to now have two cohorts in the collaborative, right? Because, most schools can at least find one other school that's going through a similar journey, has the same problems. Because I certainly don't have all the answers.
Exactly.
But within the community, there's a lot of crowdsourcing, and in a community, we can problem solve together.
Well, I even think just outside of the cohort as well, if you have schools that are considering these shifts, now they have over 40 different schools that are a part of this program and they can go and get advice from. And I think that's also something really valuable as you're thinking. You mentioned earlier, it takes longer than 4 years to break that cycle and bring this change about. But if we're thinking about the broader systemic change over time, you are going to have, this very organic, authentic growth of these initiatives that are taking place. The idea of community pushback also resonated with me. And the second curiosity, Alissa, that I had was, the reactions from family or communities as a school says, hey, we're going to try these new strategies. What would you coach some schools on if they were going to their community to help them start understanding, why are we doing what we're doing?
Yeah, I feel like the easy answer is, talk to your community right away, right? Just in the sense of, sometimes I hear schools say, well, I don't have it figured out yet, so I don't want to go talk to my community about it. And I get it, and so yes, there's a case to be made for have maybe a draft plan to share with your community, or know a little bit to be able to share. But also your community doesn't want you to go to them and say you have all the answers and you don't want feedback, right? You can genuinely go to the community and say, here are the things that we think we're going to try. Here are the reasons we think this is right for kids. And what's your feedback on that? And we want to continue to engage with you and be in a dialogue with you about that and have that really authentic community engagement. Because, I felt so bad. I visited one school with a legislator, actually, and was horrified to hear they brought this, group of students to talk to us. And one student said, well, my parents don't understand the new grading system. And so, because I'm not, it's, marked as not meeting standard yet, they think I'm failing. And so I didn't get to go on my family camping trip because it looked like I was failing. And so me and the legislature and the school principal are all horrified to hear this, and I can see the panic written on the school principal's face that this legislator is hearing this, right? And so but point being, they were a school that was we're going to wait and get it figured out and then go talk to our community.
Right.
And so you have to be able to share enough with families so that there aren't these miscommunications happening between students and families, right? About what's happening and what, grading changes mean or whatever the case might be. Your communities don't want you to have all the answers figured out, but they do want you to be honest around, what are you trying and where do you want the feedback, right?
And that idea of communicating with the community first, I think really holds a lot of weight. And a lot of leaders who are making shifts are considering how to communicate to their families about these, but often that communication happens after the shifts have already been made. And, Alissa, you just almost flipped that script and said, before you start the work, start the communication with the families and with the community as a whole. And I think that is a lesson that can go far beyond just a shift to a mastery-based learning model for anybody that's trying new things. If you're implementing a portrait of a learner or a portrait of a graduate, start that process early. If you're bringing in any sort of new resources or STEM initiatives, you're starting new CTE clusters, like start that early because it's only going to be beneficial. And I think you highlighted that with that story. But to piggyback on it, you helped us understand a bit about framing that why to the community and to the families. I'm curious, how might a leader start to frame this why when they're speaking to their staff? And we can piggyback on the example you mentioned about, I have a staff who's been, teaching for 30 years. They've been doing it the same way. Why do they want to make this shift? Why do I want them to go through the learning and make a change?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, like my first response is to be flip, which is not always helpful. I'm going to say it anyway, and then, we can keep talking. But like part of me wants to say like, okay, if you're, a teacher that's been teaching for 30 years and your students are engaging with you and they're learning really well and you're happy with your test scores and all the other things, like, okay, don't make a change. Like, cool. But if you're not happy with your test scores or you don't see students engaging with you and you don't feel like students are learning, like, what do you have to lose?
Right.
Like, yes, it's gonna be a change. Like, I feel like when I talk to people that have been in this work longer than I have, I think we would all fully admit, like, this is a lot of work at first, but it's not more work, right? Like, it's the right work later on. As far as, there's a lot of work to kind of change lesson plans and think about, where you're going to give students opportunities to have that ownership over their learning and kind of think differently about your curriculum and your instruction. But then in the end, it's not more work, and it's actually more fun to be engaging with a group of students when they're excited about the learning than it is when students are bored. They have their headphones in, they're, whatever the case might be, because they're not engaged in their learning. So I think if you think about like, what do you want to be different in school? And then think about, what is the research support around how you get students engaged? Like the research really supports, like when students have more choice in their learning, they're more engaged. When you are bringing in examples of, a variety of perspectives, and students can relate to the curriculum, students are more engaged, right? And so you have to kind of think about, what do you want to get out of this and how do you want to better serve your students?
The story about the student with the headphone on, not hitting the test scores, hits home pretty hard, because I just think back to grade 9 French. I was not a French speaker. I had the headphones in. I was that student in the class, and I had no connection to the instruction, and my test scores really showed what that was. But my teacher at the time never actually put an emphasis on trying to change that. It was like, okay, you don't want to do the work, that's fine. So I think it's a really good call out for teachers to just think critically about their practice.
And I think too, like sometimes, we have to get curious about why students are engaging, right? Because, maybe a student has their headphones in because they're neurodivergent and they actually need their headphones in to be able to focus better, right? So, but some teachers may not know that if they don't take the time to get to know their students. And so I think, that's really the benefit of a culturally responsive mastery-based learning system too, is it's really prioritizing relationships first. And then again, when research would say, when you have a good relationship with your students, then the learning is going to come after that, right? But you have to be able to get to know your students to have a better sense of, what methods are going to reach your students in a helpful way.
And that all just pulls back really beautifully to the sentiment you mentioned earlier about, if you can establish a good relationship, it's going to make it a more welcoming environment. That students going to be more comfortable. They're going to feel safe in that building, and they're going to want to be their authentic self and engage in the learning versus otherwise not. And it just takes that relationship. And I think, as a human being, building relationships is hard. And I think when you were talking about, doing this work, it can be hard at first before it becomes easy, fun, and rewarding. And I feel like for a lot of teachers who come from a more traditional model where it was very much, discipline oriented, stick to the schedule, do the quiz, do the test, and move on. They were never taught the relationship aspect. And as somebody who relationships is what I do day to day, it is hard to do that. But I just love how this model focuses on the relationship and is providing actual resources for teachers to build the relationship and be the trusted adult when sometimes the students don't have another trusted adult in their lives.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. Because, I think I don't think I've ever talked to a teacher that's like, I got into teaching because I don't like kids, right? Like teachers get into teaching because they like students and they want to relate to students and they want to see those light bulb moments.
Yeah.
But admittedly, being from a state perspective, I know there's a ton of rules and regulations and paperwork and all these things that teachers have to deal with on a daily basis. That is not the fun part. That is not why they got into teaching. But I think that that's why we have had, even in the midst of COVID, I mean, when we released our first application, for our first cohort of schools, I was terrified that no one would apply because I'm like, teachers are burned out.
Sure.
They don't want to do extra work and I don't blame them. Like I've got little kids. I'm exhausted at the end of the day. Like I don't blame them for not wanting to do extra work. And yet, I feel like we're seeing so many schools that are saying, yes, that's some of my teachers, understandably, and rightfully so in some cases. But then I have these other teachers that are just ready to try new things because what do they have to lose? And so I think being able to sort of give teachers permission, sometimes to be able to focus on the relationships. It was really funny. I went to a PD event about a year ago where I was talking with a math teacher and she was like, I would really love to do all this project-based learning stuff that's part of mastery-based learning. That would be super cool. But I have to cover all these standards. I have to get through my curriculum or test scores will drop. And like, you're the State Board of Education. You care about test scores. And I was like, well, I'm not going to speak on behalf of every education agency in the state. That's not my role. But I will say personally, I could care less about your test scores. Like, yes, they are an indicator of the one thing they were designed to measure, like how the student's learning is on that day and that specific snapshot in time. Like, I'm not saying don't ever look at the test scores, but also like, I don't want you to design your entire year around one snapshot in time.
Right.
Like, and what if the student didn't have breakfast that morning and they were running late or they had a fight with their parent or God forbid, like they had horrible news that day? Like, I don't care that much about the test scores. And, and what I said to her is like, and also side note, like deeper learning comes out of project-based learning. And so eventually your test scores are going to go up. But if they drop for a year or two, like, I don't care. And I think like, so then she runs screaming around the room, like State Board of Education says that they don't care about test scores, which like, fine, like, okay. And, if my board members heard that, yikes. But, my point was, right, sometimes teachers need permission to get outside of their box, get outside of all the rules and regulations and all the things they have to juggle, and just have that permission to be innovative for a while, and that's going to pay off.
It takes a strong leader often to be able to grant that space. And that's why I love that you have the cohorts to provide the space to them. But I also see a big connection to that ability for the teacher to get out of the box and some of the big issues that we're facing, teacher retention. You mentioned the budget crisis around hiring enough teachers to actually service these students. We know that being a teacher is a very rewarding job, but it's a hard job. And if teachers aren't able to have fun, they're not going to want to continue being a teacher. And I'm just seeing a big connection to this freedom to try new things and a direct correlation to how it's going to help you retain teachers that are happier and less burnt out over time, right? But to kind of pull back to the test scores, and I'm not going to kind of harp on the expectation of reporting on test scores, but we know that they are a reality. Standardized tests are a reality. Test scores are a reality. How do you see mastery-based learning intersecting with the state standards, the test scores, and the graduation requirements? How do you see them all kind of intersecting together to push to the outcome of better learning for students?
Yeah, I mean, I think my simple answer would be, schools implementing mastery-based learning, they still have students have to meet the same state standards. They have to meet the same graduation requirements. They're just going to do that in different ways. Like we said earlier, kind of that demonstration of mastery is going to look different, but they're still meeting all of the same high expectations of students in more traditional schools. And I think some people would argue that mastery-based learning may actually be more, quote, rigorous because it supports that deeper learning and that more explicit demonstration of the learning standards than more, quote, traditional seat time and assessment models. Now, I think, first of all, implementation takes a long time, as we said earlier. And so, it may be that as schools are sort of shifting some of their instruction, perhaps there'll be a drop in test scores. I don't know. I could see that happening in some places and not in others. But I think, long term, if the state stays the course, if the schools stay the course, right, which we're famous in education for not, but if we really stay the course long term, I think that there is a really darn good chance that assessment scores are going to go up because of that deeper learning. We just have to give it the time to let that happen.
I also think that's a really, really important call out to give the time for this to happen. I was speaking with a leader recently, and when we were chatting about the biggest challenge to implementing a competency-based model in their system was getting the teacher buy-in. And then that it took that superintendent to go and have conversations with all the teachers. And they asked outright, why aren't you buying into this shift? And those teachers said, because it's a fad. This is a fad. You're going to be pushing it for 3 to 4 years. I'm going to change all of my instruction. And then the next fad's going to come in and you're going to ask me to do it again. And I don't have the capacity to do that. So I'm curious from your perspective, just, if you have those conversations to help with some of that longevity of these, knowing that the deeper learning is going to come and knowing that the test scores and the student engagement is going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, just as far as you're asking, how do you convince teachers to wait it out?
Yeah, exactly. Like, how do you convince a teacher to do that?
Yeah, I mean, no, it's a good question. I think, like most things, there are some people that you're never going to reach, right? So there's always going to be a couple teachers that are just going to wait it out to retirement, or they're going to go find different jobs and schools that aren't making these changes. I'm like, okay, great. Like, you go find a place where you feel like you need to be if you don't want to be here, is what I've heard some leaders say to their teachers like that. But I think there's a lot of teachers. I was talking to a teacher a couple of days ago, actually, and she asked a similar question. She was like, is State Board going to continue supporting this? What about other education agencies? And I'm like, well, I would never speak on behalf of another institution that is not my own, because that is not my role. But, what I can say is, there are still legislators that have a lot of support for this. State Board has a lot of support for this. I'm like, and it's the right thing for kids. And so while I can't predict the future, I wish I could. I'd be a gajillionaire. Wouldn't have to worry about paying for kids' college. But, I think this is something that's going to stick around because it's the right thing for kids, because it's based on research around how kids learn. And she said, well, of course, I hoped you would have a crystal ball. But she was like, in some ways, it was a rhetorical question, because she was like, I agree with you. Like, it's the right thing. And, all the time that me and my colleagues are spending making, some of these changes in our models, like, I think we do it anyway. It's the right thing to do. And so I'm not going to feel like my time is wasted if, in a couple of years you have a different boss, State Board isn't supporting this. And I'm like, well, I don't think that's going to happen. But I'm so glad to hear you say that regardless, like, you're going to stick it out. It was very affirming for her to sort of be like, yeah, I didn't really think you'd have an answer. And you're right. Like, I don't, having been in it longer now, this is the right thing and we're going to keep going.
And I know from speaking with teachers who are saying, this is just what's right for kids, I'm going to make that shift and I'm going to do this work. I know a lot of teachers, when they actually dive into it, go to that first professional learning session, kind of walk away with that aha moment of, wow, I've actually been doing a lot of this already. I just never knew what it was called. And I just love when that aha moment happens for that teacher, and then they just get super engaged and they're just really excited to dive in and start shifting that practice even further and trying and challenging themselves day in and day out. But I'm curious because you have the lucky perspective of hearing from a lot of schools in this collaborative. So broadly, this is a very broad question, but I'm curious what sort of changes that you've been seeing happening in schools who have started adopting some of these practices.
Well, first of all, I would recommend you read our 80-page evaluation report from Aurora Institute if you're really curious about this question. So, for all of you listening that have a ton of spare time, you should totally go read that report or at least skim the executive summary. But, I was talking to someone else today who was like, well, what'd you learn from the report? Because, spoiler, he was not going to go read it. And I'm like, well, in some ways it was just really affirming because I feel like the report showed what we keep hearing anecdotally, right? Which is that we keep hearing, number one, kind of like we've talked about, teachers in the collaborative saying how energizing it's been to really focus on that hands-on, student-centered, culturally responsive learning because they're part of a community, because they can do it together, right? But I think for some of the schools that we're seeing, some of the smaller schools in particular that have been able to move faster. And so they're getting some, faster results because it just takes less time to norm with the staff and make progress in smaller schools oftentimes. That we're seeing, this work start to bear some fruit, right? So one really powerful example is there's a school that serves students that have really disengaged from traditional school. And so they're serving a lot of students that have a lot of compounding factors in their life that have made it hard to engage in a huge comprehensive high school. Some are parents, some are supporting, parents of young kids in high school, some are supporting their families, they've got all this stuff going on. And so, and yet, this school is seeing that the student populations that have benefited the most from their participation in the MBLC are students that have disabilities, students that were super credit deficient, and so they weren't going to graduate on time in a comprehensive high school, and students of color. They are seeing over the course of several years that their student pass rates and their credit earning has gone way up because they're having their students engage, right? So, in 2021 to 22, I'm looking at my notes, 54% of their students pass their classes. That's pretty low, right? Just 54% of students. 2 years later, they're looking at 72% of their students passing all of their classes. So the fact that they've had an almost 20% jump in students passing all of their classes in 2 years is incredible and on track to graduate. And we're talking about some of the most credit deficient students in the state. And, the school was designed to help them. So I think, just the fact that they are finding ways to reach kids in a way that's really fun and students are enjoying their learning again, that's a huge win. I think kind of overall, broadly, the evaluation showed that about a third of educators and about half of school leaders in the MBLC cohort 1 agreed that students have become more engaged in and taken greater ownership over their learning. And so, again, are those numbers as high as I would like? Of course not, but we're only a couple years in. And so the fact that we even can report on that at all, and that a third of educators and half of school leaders are saying students are more engaged is awesome. And the educators that are seeing the students who are more engaged are saying that students are also more willing to give their opinions in class and engage with each other, engage with peers, and that students are also progressing academically in their learning. And so I think we're seeing some kind of early signs of success that are really exciting. And I can only imagine what we're going to see in another couple of years.
I love that line of just seeing students getting to enjoy learning again. And I feel like there was this large gap, and we used to always make jokes about it. You sit down with the kids at the dinner table. Hey, what did you do at school today? And they say, I did nothing. I did nothing. And you're trying to pry out of them. And, now that I'm in a position where I understand the realities of the classroom, being a former teacher, it just makes me think so much about that joke and it's just about that student being so disengaged that they're actually not taking anything away, and they don't have that curiosity or that love of learning. And so many of the things that we see our students going through, whether it be disengagement, addictions to things like cell phones and social media and all that sort of stuff, it's like, did they miss out? Did they not have those engaging learning opportunities to develop that growth mindset at an earlier stage where they're curious to go and learn something new on the weekend, pick up the book from the library and engage in a story that's, really, really amazing? And I just love that you're seeing these shifts take place and you're actually getting data to show that these shifts are working. It's pretty inspiring. We almost need to have a road show where you can just pull these success stories out and just go across North America and share, because it is really inspiring for people that are looking to bring any sort of change to their system. Speaking of shifts, there's a lot of shifts that do need to take place, obviously, to bring this in a broader way. I'm curious what sort of policy shifts that you see happening at the state level to allow schools to adopt these models. I know recently things like the performance-based pathways and how that is coming into play. So just talk to us a little bit about some of these policy shifts that you guys are supporting.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned the performance-based pathway, maybe we'll start there. But in Washington, for folks that aren't familiar with our graduation requirements, very quick primer in that we have three big kind of categories of graduation requirements. So we have our credit and subject area requirements, like most states. Students have to have a high school and beyond plan that sort of guides their high school experience based on their plans for post-secondary. And then students have to meet a graduation pathway option. And so like most states, we used to have a requirement where students had to pass like an end of year assessment to graduate. But a few years back, the legislature created a system of graduation pathways. So you could still pass the state assessment and that be your indicator that you're ready to move on to post-secondary, or you could pass the SAT, ACT if you're wanting to go to college, although maybe less relevant now that so many colleges have gone test optional, but I digress. You could do like a sequence of CTE courses or take the ASVAB if you want to enter the military, right? So a lot of them were still tests, but at least it was, a few different options for students. But a lot of the mastery-based learning schools in our state tend to be fairly small. Not all. We have several comprehensive, huge schools in the collaborative that have their own sets of struggles, right? But particularly for schools that I think are small or are rural that just aren't offering as many of the graduation pathway options, we saw some of the MBL schools really struggling to have their students meet those. And so we wanted to design. And beyond that, actually, the state board did some research over several years to see, do students and families see these graduation pathway options as relevant? And shocker, they didn't, because most of them were tests. And so we wanted to design a graduation pathway that was a lot more customizable and individual, that would align with mastery-based learning. And so I think that we're going to see this performance-based pathway, like a performance-based assessment, essentially, be really popular across the state, but I think particularly in our mastery-based learning schools. And so we're super excited about it. And we have a ton of information on the State Board of Education website around the performance-based pathway, because we designed a lot of tools like statewide rubrics and the focus standards students would need to meet, and then gave guidance on and here's all the wide open flexibility around how students could demonstrate this, and some training videos around how to, for teachers that aren't in mastery-based learning schools that wanted to use this and think about how do you really use a performance-based assessment, some training videos for that. But I think that's really exciting because it shows kind of some broader interest even beyond the mastery-based learning schools, and having some of these components, like maybe a school isn't ready to go full mastery-based learning, right, but maybe they want to have some more performance-based assessments or have some components of this. So that's super exciting to see. As far as other policy shifts, there's been a couple, or at least some that are forthcoming, maybe haven't come to fruition yet, but I know in our state, the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, which is our large state department separate from the State Board of Education, OSPI is responsible for funding in our state. And we have several different funding models, based on a more traditional seat time model. We have some funding models for alternative learning experiences, more like online schools. We have work-based learning models, but all of that to say, there's not really a mastery-based learning funding model. There's not one that fits those schools well. And so, the schools have said that they feel kind of shoehorned into those models. And so OSPI is exploring, would they adapt a funding model to better fit some of the mastery-based learning schools, or would they create a new one? And so, I don't know where OSPI is going to land on that yet, but it's really exciting that they're thinking about that, thinking about how would we want to fund perhaps mastery-based learning schools differently. And think about, maybe there's some extra regulations that they're going to have to jump through some hoops if they want a different funding model. But again, I digress. It's exciting to have OSPI thinking about that and trying to better support those schools.
Well, I think they're listening, which is also a huge asset. They're listening, and you are providing proof of these, so they're listening and adapting, which I think is a really critical collaboration that you guys are having together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I probably should have said that Mastery-Based Learning Collaborative, while the State Board of Education runs it, some of the two biggest K-12 agencies in our state, the OSPI that I mentioned, as well as the Professional Educator Standards Board, they both are executive sponsors of the project. So there's some involvement with their staff and interest in wanting to support those schools from sort of their areas of authority, which is fantastic. We couldn't do this work without them. I think one other policy potential change, we'll see what happens, is, this past legislative session, there was a bill that didn't make it all the way through the process, but we think may come back this session. We'll see. But it was really exciting because Senate Bill 6264 would have laid some important groundwork for some various system changes that likely would have been helpful to mastery-based learning schools in the future. Like, for instance, it would have recommended a process for the state to create statewide competencies aligned to the state learning standards so that schools didn't have to individually develop those, like have sort of some sample statewide competencies that then schools could adapt as needed, save, all those schools having to do that from scratch. It also would have developed a statewide mastery transcript. And it would have developed a process for identifying schools that are implementing mastery-based learning. So there were some really exciting things that were part of that bill. So we'll see. We'll see if it comes back next session. We anticipate it might, and we'll see what happens.
The idea of having just the statewide competencies, I think, is so critical because, as you mentioned, with the cohorts being so specific to their schools and their region, it just gives them a starting off place to take and then customize. I know within the state of Kentucky, they have their statewide competencies established, but out of their 171 districts, something like 115 plus have localized. So this way they had that framework, they had that support, and now they're able to go and localize to bring about that change. And they've seen a really massive shift. It happened really quickly because of that support, which I think is really awesome to see. But Alissa, just as we're kind of wrapping up our conversation here today, I'm always curious. We ask every guest this question. Why do you see mastery-based learning as critical to the future of our K-12 education system?
Oh, well, that's a real small question. Okay. I think first and foremost, students across Washington and likely across other states are really asking for learning experiences that are meaningful, that are relevant, and that are in alignment with their future goals. And so, I think it's really important to think about, whether it's mastery-based learning or whether it's other strategies. I mean, I would advocate for mastery-based learning, but I think we have to think about, what are the strategies that we're going to use to really focus on creating more light bulb moments and having students really experience that hands-on experiential learning that research shows really sticks more than those traditional methods of learning coming straight out of a textbook. Now, again, many teachers are not just, pulling lessons from a textbook. I'm overgeneralizing here, but I think when the focus really shifts to learning that is relevant to students' lives, like research shows that students are more engaged and they learn more deeply. And so I think, with culturally responsive mastery-based learning really helps educators shift their focus from a system that was intentionally set up to rank and sort students towards a more student-centered model that allows for that student flexibility and choice and agency and equity both inside and outside of that classroom. And so when you're focusing on meeting students where they are and that you're building those strong relationships and fostering that equitable school culture, then you're really setting students up for success, actually in the 21st century, right? Like as cliche as that sounds, like we have to adapt the way that we are teaching students to be in line with how rapidly our world is changing. And so I think that, mastery-based learning, research would show, is one way we can do that and do that really well.
Listening, adapting, and supporting meaningful learning for students to set them up for success in the 21st century. Alissa, it's been amazing having you on the show. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, the insights from your whole team. And I'm really excited to see where the mastery-based learning initiative is going to be going within the state of Washington.
Thanks, Jordan. Me too. I wish I had that crystal ball so I could see what's going to happen in a couple of years.
Listeners, keep your eye out. Keep your eye out on what's going on in Washington State, because there's some really amazing work happening. Again, Alissa, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks, Jordan.
That was the Director of Policy with the Washington State Board of Education, Alissa Muller. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Let us know in the comments what sort of topics you'd like to be covered on future episodes, and please make sure to hit the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode. I'm Jordan Lewis, and you've been listening to the Growth Over Grades podcast.